The vintage red hit her before the insult did. It was cold.
Did you see
the kind
that?
of cold that feels like
What
a
an
burn when it's
absolute
poured over your head in a room
disgrace.
full of people who are supposed
That
to
is
be your
completely
betters.
unacceptable.
Welcome to
He
Korean
ruined
Mafia
her
Love
uniform.
Tailors, your
What an
ultimate
absolute
destination for gripping
disgrace.
stories of the Korean Mafia, underworld crime, and forbidden interracial romance.
Did you see that?
Dive into
What
thrilling
an
Mafia
absolute
tales filled with
disgrace.
dangerous love.
That is
betrayal,
completely
obsession,
unacceptable.
and passion
He
set in the
ruined her
dark and
uniform.
mysterious underworld.
What an absolute
Our
disgrace.
stories feature powerful Korean mafia bosses, strong female leads, and intense romantic connections that cross cultures and boundaries. If you love mafia romance, Korean drama vibes, billionaire love stories, and underworld tales, this channel is for you. Subscribe for weekly uploads of addictive mafia stories, Korean underworld romance, love tales, and dramatic storytelling that will keep you hooked till the end. If you want to see how this story goes, stay with me until the very end. And as we begin, hit that like button and tell me in the comments, have you been humiliated before? The rooftop lounge was a cage of glass and gold, and for the first time in 3 years, Lila Monroe felt the bars pressing against her ribs. The vintage Cabernet continued its slow, sticky descent from her hairline, staining the white lace of her collar a deep, bruised purple. Across the table, Victor Kang didn't look like a visionary CEO. He looked like a bored boy who had just broken a toy to see if it would cry.
Can't believe he did that right
He
here.
leaned back, his $50,000 watch catching the overhead light, a smirk playing on his lips as he watched the wine drip onto the floor. You should thank me, Victor drawled, his voice carrying easily over the hushed whispers of the elite
Can't believe he did that
patrons.
right here.
That bottle costs more than your annual salary. You're wearing more wealth right now than you'll ever earn.
I can't
The
believe he did
lounge
that right
manager,
here.
a man named Marcus who had praised Leela's unmatched work ethic only yesterday, scurried into the light. He didn't look at the wine-soaked woman or the shattered glass at her feet. He looked only at Victor, his hands clasped in a gesture of frantic supplication. "Mr. Kang, I am beyond mortified," Marcus stammered, his face a mask of spineless desperation. This was an inexcusable lapse in service. We pride ourselves on the comfort of our donors. Leela found her voice, though it felt thin and cold. "He poured a bottle of wine over my head, Marcus. He touched me. I refused in advance, and
We're going to have to let you go. Please
You're
leave the
done,
premises
Leela,"
now.
Marcus
This is
snapped,
unbelievable.
finally turning to her with
Another round,
eyes that were
please.
hard and empty. "Your
have
aggressive
to let you
attitude
go.
has made our
Please leave
most
the premises
valued
now.
guest uncomfortable.
This is
Pack your
unbelievable.
things. You're
Another
fired,
round, please.
effective immediately." A ripple of low laughter came from Victor's table. Leela felt the heat of 1,000 judgmental eyes, but she didn't lower her gaze. She looked at Marcus, a man who had traded his integrity for a donation, and then at Victor, who was already signaling for another bottle as if she had already ceased to exist. Leela didn't cry. She didn't scream. She reached up, wiped a stray drop of red from her cheek, and untied her apron. She draped the stained fabric over the back of an empty chair, the movement slow and deliberate. She walked through the lounge, her spine a column of iron, the wet slap of her shoes the only sound in the sudden, expectant silence. The man in gray at the corner table watched her pass, his phone held low as he captured the final image of her exit. As the elevator doors slid shut, Leela stood alone in the mirrored box, her reflection a fractured image of ruined lace and dark wine. She stepped out into the humid Atlanta night, the rain beginning to fall, mixing with the Cabernet until the scent of grapes and ozone filled her lungs. She was jobless, humiliated, and blacklisted, but as she walked into the shadows of the city, she realized that the sparrow she had pretended to be was dead. The Monroe in her was finally waking up. The morning light was cruel, highlighting the deep crimson stains on the floor of Leela's apartment that no amount of scrubbing could fully erase. She didn't have time to mourn a rug. She had rent due and a reputation to salvage. By noon, she had swapped her ruined lace for a crisp, professional blazer, her hair pulled back into a tight, no-nonsense bun. She was Lila Monroe, a woman who had built a life on her own terms, and she refused to let one false king tear it down. Her first stop was the Obsidian, a high-end jazz club where the floor manager had been begging her to join his staff for months. But as she stepped toward the host stand, the manager, a man who usually met her with a wide grin, suddenly found a very intense interest in his fingernails. "I'm sorry, Leela," he whispered, refusing to meet her eyes. I got a call this morning from a very high-placed friend of Victor Kang. They said hearing you would be a significant liability for our liquor license. Leela felt a cold needle of dread prick her spine. A liability? Marcus fired me for being assaulted. I know what happened, the manager said, finally looking up with a flash of genuine pity. But in this city, Victor's money talks louder than the truth. You're radioactive, Leela. Nobody in the district will touch you. She didn't stop. She went to the Sapphire Lounge, then the Velvet Room, and finally a small, independent bistro where the owner didn't even care about high society politics. At every door, the result was the same. A sudden change in staffing needs. An unfortunate internal audit. A security guard who recognized her face from a digital memo and shook his head before she could even reach the handle. Victor Kang hadn't just fired her. He was erasing her ability to survive. He was using his billionaire influence to turn the city into a desert where no one would give her a drop of water. By the time the sun began to dip below the skyline, painting the clouds in a shade of violet that reminded her too much of the spilled wine, Leela found herself sitting on a park bench. Her feet ached with the kind of deep, bone-weary hurt that lived in the marrow, the same hurt she had tried to escape years ago. She watched the elite of Atlanta drive past in their black sedans, untouchable and indifferent. They saw a woman on a bench, soft and alone, another disposable piece of the service industry discarded by a powerful man. They didn't see the ice settling in her expressive eyes or the way her jaw set into a line of absolute, terrifying resolve. Victor had turned her into a ghost, but he had forgotten one thing. Ghosts are the only ones who can walk through walls. Leela reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing against the cold plastic of a burner phone she hadn't touched in years. The sparrow was tired of hiding. The apartment was too quiet, the kind of silence that didn't just sit in the room but pushed against the skin. Leela stood in the center of her small kitchen. Her shadow stretched long and thin across the linoleum floor by the flickering street lamp outside. The scent of ozone and wet pavement clung to her blazer, a reminder of the miles she had walked through a city that had suddenly turned its back on her. She looked at her hands. They were still shaking, not from fear, but from the sheer, exhausting weight of holding herself together for too long. She walked to the bedroom and reached into the back of her closet, pushing aside the sensible shoes and the neatly pressed uniforms of a life she had tried so hard to build with her own hands. Tucked into a shoebox beneath a stack of old nursing school pamphlets was a small, black burner phone. It was cold and heavy, a relic from a world she had promised her mother she would never enter. For 4 years, it had remained dark, a silent tether to a man whose quiet power could make the very foundation of the city tremble. Leela sat on the edge of her bed, the springs groaning in the dark. She thought of Victor Kang's dismissive smirk, the sting of the wine in her eyes, and the way Marcus had looked through her as if she were already a ghost. They had mistaken her kindness for weakness and her silence for surrender. They saw a girl from Savannah with a heart-shaped face and assumed she was hollow, never realizing she had been forged in a fire they couldn't even imagine. Her thumb hovered over the power button. The screen flickered to life, casting a harsh blue glow over her features, making her expressive eyes look like polished flint. There was only one contact saved, a single letter that had haunted her dreams and offered a protection she had spent years refusing. She had wanted to be a sparrow, to live a small, normal life where her last name didn't make men in expensive rooms go quiet and careful. But the world didn't want a sparrow, it wanted a victim. The call connected on the first ring. There was no greeting, just a heavy, expectant silence on the other end, the sound of a man who had been waiting 4 years for this exact vibration. Leela closed her eyes, the last of the false king's influence evaporating as she felt the shift in her own gravity. "It's me," she whispered, her voice finally steady, finally sharp. "I'm tired of being a sparrow, brother." The response was a single, low breath, the sound of a predator finally given permission to hunt. "I've been waiting, Leela," Dominic's voice came through, a surgical calm that made the air in her room go still. "Stay where you are. The shadows are coming home." The boardroom of Kang International was a cathedral of glass and ego. Situated so high in the Atlanta skyline, that the clouds seemed to wait for Victor's permission to pass. Victor sat at the head of the mahogany table, his tailored suit without a single wrinkle, his expression one of bored supremacy as he watched his board members argue over quarterly projections. He was the false king in his element, a man who believed his wealth was a fortress that no mere mortal, and certainly no waitress, could ever breach. "The expansion into the European markets is non-negotiable," Victor said, his voice a quiet power that instantly silenced the room. He checked his $50,000 watch, the same one that had caught the light while wine dripped off Leela's chin, and felt a surge of predatory satisfaction. He had erased her from the city's service industry with a few phone calls, and now he was about to cement his legacy. The heavy double doors at the back of the room opened. It wasn't a grand entrance, but the silence that followed it was absolute. His CFO, a man usually composed of spreadsheets and iron, hurried toward the head of the table. His face was the color of unbaked dough, and his hands were trembling so violently that the tablet he held rattled against his wedding ring. "Victor," the CFO whispered, leaning down so close that the rest of the board leaned in instinctively. "We have a catastrophic liquidity event." Victor didn't even look up. "Fix it, that's what I pay you for." "You don't understand," the man hissed, his voice cracking. "The Monroe Syndicate, the private equity firm that anchored our Series C funding. They just pulled everything. $600 million gone in a single wire transfer." The air in the boardroom seemed to vanish. Victor finally looked up, his smirk faltering as he saw the bloodless terror in his CFO's eyes. "They can't do that. There are contracts. There are moral turpitude clauses." "They triggered the reputational risk clause, Victor," the CFO interrupted, his voice rising in panic. "They cited an incident at a rooftop lounge involving the assault of a service worker. They're claiming we are a high-risk liability." Victor felt a sudden, icy chill settle in his marrow. At that exact moment, every phone on the mahogany table began to vibrate in a discordant, frantic rhythm. The audience of judgment was receiving the news. The market was reacting. In the span of a single breath, the false king's empire had begun to bleed out. He looked at the glass walls of his office and realized they weren't protecting him. They were showing the world exactly how fast he was falling. The sparrow hadn't just flown away. She had brought the storm back with her. The evening at the rooftop lounge began with a frantic, stuttering energy that had nothing to do with the guest list. Marcus, the manager, paced the marble foyer, his eyes darting to the elevators every time they chimed. He had spent the morning fielding calls from panicked board members and furious donors, all demanding to know why the Kang incident was suddenly trending in the private circles of the city's elite. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and the metallic tang of impending disaster. The shift happened at exactly 8:00 p.m. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass walls, the staff watched as a synchronized line of 7 black sedans pulled onto the curb 40 stories below. They moved with a surgical precision, blocking off the entrance to the building like a barricade. Inside the lounge, the music faltered. Guests drifted toward the windows, their hushed whispers rising into a low hum of anxiety. "Is it the SEC?" someone whispered. "A federal raid." Marcus felt a bead of sweat roll down his temple. He signaled to the security team, but even they looked paralyzed, their hands hovering near their radios as they watched the monitors. Dozens of men in perfectly tailored black suits stepped out of the vehicles. They didn't shout. They didn't draw weapons. They simply stood in a formation that screamed quiet power, a dark perimeter that seemed to claim the very ground the building stood upon. The elevator bank in the lobby hissed open. On the lounge level, the lights flickered once, then stabilized into a dim, predatory amber. The audience of judgment stood frozen as the primary elevator climbed, the floor numbers ticking upward with a steady, rhythmic thrum that sounded like a heartbeat. Marcus stood at the entrance, his spine stiff, prepared to beg for his liquor license or his life. But when the doors finally slid open, it wasn't a tactical team that stepped out. It was a vanguard of 3 men, their faces etched in a stony, unmovable discipline that made the false king's security look like children playing at war. They stepped aside, creating a path of absolute deference. Behind them stood Dominic Monroe. He was dressed in a suit of charcoal wool that seemed to absorb the room's light, his presence a heavy, undeniable gravity that made the oxygen feel scarce. He didn't look at the bar, the view, or the trembling manager. He looked only at the chair where Leela had draped her stained apron only 24 hours before. "I'm looking for the manager," Dominic said, his voice a low, melodic baritone that carried to every corner of the silent room. Marcus stepped forward, his knees nearly buckling under the weight of that gaze. I am Marcus, sir. May I ask who is?" "You may not," Dominic interrupted, his surgical calm more terrifying than a shout. "You've spent the last 3 years working for a man who leased this space. I am the man who owns the dirt beneath his feet, and tonight I've come to collect the arrears." The silence in the lounge was no longer the hushed reverence of the elite. It was the suffocating stillness of a tomb. Dominic Monroe moved through the space with a quiet power that made the sprawling, high-concept architecture of the room feel small and fragile. He didn't look at the expensive art or the terrified faces of the patrons. His expressive eyes were fixed on the distance, focused on a specific coordinate of disrespect. "The table," Dominic said, his voice a low, clinical baritone that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of Marcus's bones. Marcus swallowed, his throat feeling like it was lined with glass. "Sir, I don't. Which table?" Dominic stopped. He didn't turn his head, but the air around him seemed to drop 10 degrees. "The one where a man who thinks he is a king poured wine over the head of a woman he wasn't worthy to look at. The table where my sister was told she was disposable." The audience of judgment gasped in a single, jagged breath. The rumor of the nanny or the waitress was one thing, but the word sister coming from the mouth of a Monroe was a death sentence for anyone who had stood by and watched. Marcus felt the blood drain from his face until his skin matched the white lilies on the host's stand. His spineless heart hammered against his ribs as the memory of his own words, "Asterisk, you're done. Leela asterisk," played back in his mind like a taunt. "Table 7, Marcus whispered, his voice cracking. It was table 7, Mr. Monroe." Dominic began to walk again, his steps slow and deliberate, the heavy click of his heels on the marble floor marking the seconds of Marcus's professional life ticking away. He reached the table where Victor Kang had sat only 24 hours ago. He pulled out the chair, the same one where Leela had draped her stained apron, and sat down. He didn't lean back. He sat with the regal, terrifying composure of a real king reclaiming a stolen throne. "Bring me the wine list," Dominic commanded, though he didn't look at the manager. "Of course, sir," Marcus stammered, turning to flee toward the cellar. "And Marcus," Dominic's voice caught him like a hook. The manager froze, his hand trembling on the service door. "Make sure you include the bottle Victor Kang used as a weapon. I want to see exactly how much he thought my sister's dignity was worth." The manager realized then that he hadn't just fired a waitress. He had insulted a sovereign. He had stood on the side of a false king, while the real power was watching from the shadows. As he hurried away, Marcus knew that by the time the sun rose, his name, his career, and his world would be as empty as the bottle that had started it all. The elevator doors hissed open, and Victor Kang stormed into the rooftop lounge, his face a mask of sweating, frantic aggression. He had lost $600 million in an hour, and he was looking for someone to bleed for it. When he saw the man sitting at table 7, the very table where he had humiliated Leela, he didn't see a real king. He saw an obstacle. "Who the hell are you?" Victor barked, slamming his hand onto the mahogany surface, oblivious to the fact that the entire audience of judgment was backing away in terror. "This is my club, my table. Get out before I have my security throw you off this roof." Dominic Monroe didn't flinch. He didn't even look up from the wine list. He simply turned a page, the surgical calm of his movements making Victor's outburst look like the tantrum of a child. "Your security is currently being interviewed by my legal team downstairs," Dominic said, his voice a low, melodic baritone that cut through Victor's noise like a blade. "And as for this table, you haven't owned the rights to sit at it for exactly 42 minutes. Victor let out a jagged, desperate laugh. "I built this empire. I own the tech, the buildings, the very air you're breathing." Dominic finally looked up. His expressive eyes held a quiet power that made Victor's breath hitch in his throat. He reached into his charcoal blazer and pulled out a single, thin folder. He slid it across the table. It wasn't a thick stack of papers. It was a paper trail of absolute destruction. "You built an empire on debt, Victor," Dominic said quietly. "The venture capital you used to fund your IPO, that was Monroe syndicate money. The mortgage on your penthouse in Buckhead. Sold to a Monroe subsidiary 3 months ago. Even the lease on the vintage Ferrari you drove tonight is currently held by my holding company." Victor's hand trembled as he reached for the folder. He flipped through the pages, his eyes darting across the signatures and the seals. The blood drained from his face until his skin was the color of ash. "I called in the markers," Dominic continued, leaning forward just enough to invade Victor's space. "By the time the markets open tomorrow, your company will be delisted. Your homes will be padlocked. You aren't a billionaire anymore, Victor. You're just a man who owes me more than a lifetime of work could ever repay." Victor looked around the room, searching for the audience of judgment to save him, but he found only cold, indifferent faces. He was the false king who had finally run out of borrowed time. He looked back at Dominic, his arrogant facade crumbling into the dust of a ruined legacy. He had treated the world like it was his to break, never realizing that the man who owned the pieces was finally coming to collect. The elevator doors hissed open, and the audience of judgment drew a collective, sharp breath. Lila Monroe stepped out. No longer the wine-soaked waitress who had been cast out into the rain. She wore a structured suit of midnight silk, her hair a crown of natural curls, and her expressive eyes holding a quiet power that made the room's golden lighting seem dim by comparison. She walked toward table 7 with the deliberate, steady pace of someone who finally owned the ground beneath her feet. Victor Kang stood in the center of the lounge, stripped of his billionaire title and his arrogant facade. He looked small, a false king caught in a web of his own making. Dominic did not rise from the chair. He simply looked at Victor, his gaze a clinical, cold appraisal of a man who had finally run out of distractions. "You thought she was a sparrow, Victor," Dominic said, his voice a low, melodic baritone that carried to the furthest corners of the silent room. "You thought her dignity was something you could buy with a check or wash away with a bottle of wine. You were wrong." Dominic stood up, his tall, composed frame casting a long shadow over the ruined CEO. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a blade against Victor's throat. "My sister is the only reason you're still breathing. I wanted to erase you. She wanted to show you who she really is." Dominic's eyes flashed with a dangerous, surgical intensity. "Show her the respect you stole. Now." The silence in the lounge was absolute. Every witness, the spineless manager, the elite patrons, the security team, watched as the man who once claimed to own the city's skyline began to bend. Victor's knees trembled, and his face was a mask of sweating, agonizing humiliation. He didn't just nod. He bowed, his forehead nearly touching the very floor where Leela's clipboard had fallen 24 hours before. I am sorry," Victor stammered, his voice a jagged whimper of a man who had lost everything. Leela stood before him, her hand instinctively resting near her heart, not out of fear, but out of a sudden, grounding realization of her own strength. She didn't gloat, and she didn't scream. She simply watched him, her silent strength finally eclipsing his hollow noise. The false king was on the floor, and for the first time in years, the sparrow felt the wind beneath her wings, steady and true. The Monroe syndicate didn't need to strike. The mere weight of the truth had already crushed him. The following Monday, the rooftop lounge did not open at its usual hour. The quiet please signs remained on the glass doors, but the atmosphere inside was anything but silent. The air, once thick with the arrogant perfume of the elite, now smelled of fresh citrus and new beginnings. Lila Monroe stepped off the elevator, her heels clicking against the marble with a quiet power that made every head in the room turn in synchronized deference. She was no longer wearing the white lace collar or the stained apron of a service worker. Today, she wore a sharp, tailored blazer the color of the midnight sky, her silent strength radiating from her like a physical force. Marcus, the manager, stood by the host stand, his face pale and his spineless posture leaning into a bow that was both desperate and unprompted. He held a leather-bound folder with trembling hands, his eyes refusing to meet hers, the same eyes that had watched her be humiliated only days before. "The board is assembled in the private suite, Ms. Monroe," Marcus whispered, his voice a jagged shadow of its former self. Leela didn't offer him a smile, nor did she offer him a rebuke. She simply took the folder, her expressive eyes scanning the room she had once cleaned with sacrifice and own hands. She walked past the bar where Victor Kang had tried to erase her existence and entered the executive suite. Dominic sat at the far end of the mahogany table, his surgical calm acting as the anchor for the room. He didn't speak as she approached. He simply slid a heavy gold pen across the surface. Leela sat in the real king's chair, the weight of the Monroe syndicate now resting firmly on her shoulders. With a deliberate stroke, she signed the final page of the acquisition. The false king's hospitality group was gone. In its place was a new era, one built on the protection and dignity she had once been denied. She looked at her brother, seeing the shadows they both grew up in finally yielding to the light she had built herself. "Everything is prepared," Dominic said softly, his voice a melodic baritone of pride. Leela stood up and walked back out into the lounge. She looked at the staff, the waitresses, the cleaners, the invisible people who kept the world turning, and for the first time they weren't looking at a girl who needed saving. They were looking at the boss. Lila Monroe had spent her life trying not to be a sparrow, only to realize she was the one who owned the sky. Her story didn't end with a slap or a paper bag in the rain. It ended with her name on the building and her hand on the wheel. Here comes the end of the story. If this story moved you TAPLIKE, subscribe for more powerful stories and share your thought in the COMMENTS.